In the wrong times. Feels nice. Now this is the atrium, obviously. Check out the skylight. Steve loves his glass. And the floor is, I don't know, inlaid Italian marble or some shit like that. I don't know. It's 1984. I'm so young, so young. And it's my very first day working in the Macintosh division at Apple. And we are going to change the world. And I'm so young that I believe it. I buy into all of it. And this is my new coworker, Barry, and he's giving me a tour of the office. And it seems like every other word out of his mouth is Steve. Like, have you seen one of these? It's a compact disc player. Steve got it in Japan. It's from Sony, and pretty soon we'll all have them, and we'll all be buying compact discs, and they're $20 each, but they're well worth it, believe me, well worth it. And this is a BMW motorcycle. It belongs to Steve, and he put it here in the atrium for us to look at as an example of fine design. Isn't it beautiful? And I find out later, it's actually in the atrium because it has a broken clutch cable and it doesn't work anymore. And this fine design thing is kind of a myth. And myths are thick in this place at Apple, and most of them have Steve involved with them. So I kind of sense a connection there. And I see that talking about changing the world sounds an awful lot like a myth. Another one is, let's put a dent in the universe. We talk about putting a dent in the universe and really making a difference. Now, the funny thing about this particular group is they kind of actually did it. They really did it because if you are able to remember what computers looked like before this, they generally had green screens and black letters, and you had to type weird commands to get them to do anything. And you didn't have them in your house. You didn't have them in your pocket. And the Macintosh kind of really changed all that. So maybe they did change the world. And now I was part of it. But I noticed that I was not really one of the engineers. I was not one of the designers. I was just kind of this guy who was doing an auxiliary job called technical writer. And I'll tell you more about that until you're bored with it. But the tour continued. And Barry is walking me through the atrium, and I see at the other end of the atrium, amongst all the open offices, there is one closed office. And the closed office, the door is open, so I can kind of peek inside of it and see what's going on. And the first thing I see is the carpet has a 6-color Apple logo in it. So I kind of start to think that this is maybe where Steve has his office. And I'm not stupid, so I know it's Steve Jobs. And I know he's the head of the Macintosh division at Apple. And then, kind of to my horror, we start walking in that direction. And Barry says, come on, let's see if Steve's available, we can talk to him. And as we get closer to his office, I see he's not available, even though the door's open. He's having a quiet conversation with somebody that I can hear from half the building away. And I can figure out exactly what the conversation is just from being half a building away from it. Something about a printer. Something about a guy in there wants to build a printer at Apple. He wants to build it. Steve doesn't want him to build it. Guess who's going to win? So they're having the conversation, and as I walk past the office, as Barry's leading me by, here's what I hear. I hear Steve saying, if you make one, just one of those fucking printers, I will cut your nuts off. I swear to God, I'll cut your nuts off. My first day. And I thought, Barry's still walking like this happens every day. And I think, does this happen every day? Now, I promised or warned you that I would tell you more about this technical writer thing. I really like to say I'm an explainer. And I know explaining and mansplaining has a bad connotation today, but believe me, I'm one of the good ones. And I have this curse that if I experience something that I think is really interesting or cool or fun, I can't just keep it to myself. I mean, within the bounds of decorum. I don't walk down the street and tap strangers on the shoulder and say, hey, did you see Westworld last night? It kind of didn't suck, or whatever is appropriate. So, but I've turned this into a living as an explainer. You know those, has anybody ever looked up something on the internet for help and gotten a really, really shitty explanation of how you're supposed to do something? I didn't write that. I wrote the good ones. So when you go and see something that says, yeah, I understand that, and now I know just what to do, and bless the person who's helped me, who I'll never meet, that could have been me. So I write those kind of things. I might write the instructions that help you set up your phone. I might have written instructions for a software engineer to write the app that you love. And hopefully I've written some good ones. But once again, it's not the cool job. I'm not the maker guy. I'm not the engineer. I'm not the designer. I'm the technical writer. I have a friend who thinks, by the way, that the term technical writer is the funniest thing she's ever heard, because writer is creative and technical is boring. But that's me, technical writer. Maybe that's why I like to say explainer. But I have been really lucky in my career in landing at places like Apple when the Mac came out and getting to observe all this amazing talent doing these incredible things. Or at a company called General Magic, which kind of almost accidentally invented the smartphone in the 90s and has a documentary out now about how they did just that. And all the time I'm kind of watching and observing and learning, and I realize that's my place. My place is not to be great, it's to be adjacent to greatness. And that's why I ended up here telling these stories. And now, let's get back to the 80s. So now I'm waiting for Steve Jobs. And the receptionist says, sorry, Steve's running late. Can I get you something to drink? Would you like some herbal chamomile tea or herbal lemon tea or herbal rose hips tea or some odwalla or something? And I say, no, I'm good, thanks. Now, how did I get here? Why am I waiting for Steve Jobs? We're not at Apple anymore. The Macintosh came out and it was a massive failure. Very few people bought them. It was really underpowered. It was kind of a neat idea, but it needed a lot of work, and at first nobody bought it. Steve was rewarded by essentially being kicked out of Apple, out of his own startup. So what did he do? He started his own new company called Next Incorporated. Very clever, very kind of making a statement with just the name. And he hired 5 or 6 people from Apple, and Apple turned around and sued him. And Steve had this great line, as he often did, where he said, it's really hard to believe that a $1 billion company with 4,000 employees is afraid of 6 people in blue jeans. But they kind of were. So Next had an aura about it. It was Steve's new company, and it was secretive. They kind of said what they were doing, oh yeah, we're making a computer, and it'll be for education, and we're not going to tell you anything else until it comes out. Next sort of invented stealth mode, which is what we now call a Silicon Valley company that won't tell you what they're doing. Some of them don't know what they're doing. We call that something else, but Next presumably knew what it was doing, but Steve understood that when you don't tell somebody what you're doing, they want to know all the more. I wanted to know. I wanted to work there. So I managed to get an interview, and a job interview at Next in 1987 involved all day. You met with 8 or 9 people, one after the other, and you were asked lots of interesting questions and asked about technology and grilled. And if you made it to the last interview of the day, that was Steve Jobs. And while you drank your herbal tea, you waited for Steve to show up late. Finally, after waiting for an hour and a half for Steve, he walks in. He walks into the room. He doesn't introduce himself. Why should he? And he sits down and he looks at my resume and he says, are you the best technical writer in the world? That's his opening question to me. And I, like a dummy, thought about the answer and gave a rational, logical answer, which was, you know, the best technical writer in the world is my friend Caroline, and she already works here. And he looked really disappointed, even though he already had the best one. I guess he kind of figured he did, but then he said, okay, are you the second best technical writer in the world? And I'm slow, but I started to catch on at that point. And I really thought about it because I didn't want to lie to Steve Jobs. I thought, okay, yes, I'm the second best technical writer in the world. And he goes, okay. And he I think we could proceed from there. If I'd said no at that point, probably would have been all over. So we went from there and we kind of went back and forth. And the interview got to that point where you start to feel like they're selling you because you've done well. So I started to feel like I was being sold to. And I said, you know, I'm not sure what you're doing. It's a secret. And he said, you just have to take a leap of faith. You have to believe in what we're doing. You have to believe in it without knowing what it is. Okay. And I said, if you could just tell me something. And he said, okay. And he got up and he left the room and he came back with a little integrated circuit, about like that. Now, I don't know much about integrated circuits, let alone looking at one that was handed to me. He smiled and he handed it to me. He said, we've made this. And I looked at it, and I kind of comically shook it by my ear because I didn't know what else to do, because it didn't mean anything to me. I mean, maybe it was a toy. Maybe he bought it at Target and just decided to fool me with it. It didn't do. I said, okay, that's cool. And the interview went on. No more eventfully after that, it ended. And I felt like I was going to get an offer. And sure enough, the next day, I got a letter by FedEx that said that I had a job offer. And at the bottom, the signature line said, I accept this insanely great offer. But, you know, I didn't want to take the job. I didn't want to take the job because it was a pretty long commute and because Steve Jobs then is not what he became later. Steve Jobs then was a guy who started Apple and left. The end. And his name didn't have the same power. I didn't feel like I was passing up an incredible opportunity. And they wouldn't tell me anything about the company. So when the manager called to offer me the job, I said no. He said, are you sure? I said yes. He said, okay, Steve's going to call you just to be sure. So I thought, okay, I'm decided. You know, he's not going to change my mind. I don't want to work there. And like 30 seconds later, the phone rang. Is this Scott? Yes. Scott, who worked at Apple? Yes. This is Steve Jobs. This time he did introduce himself. He said, I just want to make sure you don't want to work at the coolest company in the Valley with the best people making the greatest computer the world has ever seen. Is that right? Do I have that correct? And I said, I do want to turn down the offer, Steve. Thank you very much. I'm turning down the offer. And he came back at me again with something less shocking. And we went back and forth for a little while, but I was stubborn, and he gave up eventually and said, okay, I guess you're not coming to work here. But I just want you to know, you blew it. And part of the interview is an IQ test to see if you're smart enough to take the offer. And you failed. In Cupertino, California, where Apple is located, nobody gets murdered. For 39 years anyway, until October 5th, 2011, when a man went to his job at a cement plant and shot up his coworkers, killed 3 of them, and escaped, and hundreds of police were looking for him in this quiet town. It was a cloudy day, it was gloomy, it was weird. There was a pall in the air. Everybody felt very odd about this horrific day. Finally, they found the guy, and he shot himself. A tragic day. 3 o'clock that afternoon, I got a call from my old friend, Barry, who was my coworker. He was still working at Apple 27 years later. I got a phone call. Can you imagine a phone call? How rare is that? And he said, we're about to announce that Steve died today. And I thought, Steve died? I mean, Steve was really sick. He had pancreatic cancer. He had a liver transplant. He had looked very frail in public for a long time. But to imagine him dying at the age of 56 was a surprise. It was a shock. And I really didn't know how to feel about it because I didn't really know him. But he touched so many people's lives in different ways, good and bad. And then I noticed the way other people were reacting to it that day and in following days. All the competitors of Apple put notes to Steve Jobs on their websites on the front page. Microsoft put their flags at half-staff for Steve Jobs. But people not in the industry, started showing up at Apple and bringing candles. And there was a huge memorial set up to these people who never met him and would never meet him and did not know him. Made a memorial of candles on the Apple campus. An Apple which doesn't let people on their campus let them do it. And the Apple stores all around the world, people wrote notes to Steve Jobs, little sticky notes, and they stuck them up on the windows. And they were 8 feet high in some of the stores. The Palo Alto store had them up to 10 feet high. I don't know how they got them up there. I guess they were sticking them up with poles all the way around. People who never met him, would never meet him, don't know him, would never know him. This guy, this genius, asshole, capitalist, Buddhist, visionary guy who changed everybody's lives had this reaction. And as for me, this guy who kind of yelled at me once, I just cried. Thank you.